In recent years, all across America, we've witnessed an abuse of power by persons of authority that wear a badge and carry a gun, culminating in the horrific death of George Floyd, which prompted prolonged and violent outrage in cities all over the country. People demanded a closer examination of how local police agencies provide safety to the community. People demand that the police provide the safety net they deserve and need, but they also demand a review of how best to provide those services. We hear arguments that the police can't prevent crimes, so the resources should be reallocated to programs the community believes will be more effective. At first, we heard loud demands for defunding the police, but then we were told that actually defunding the police wasn't what they meant. Here in Richmond, the City Council listened to their supporters and created the Reimagining Richmond Community Safety Task Force, which presented their list of recommendations to the Council as they prepared the 2021-2022 budget. Their accepted and implemented recommendations will have a significant impact on how the police provide safety for the Richmond community. Richmond Police Chief Bisa is in a position to provide insight into what this means for our community, so we're going to give her a chance to share her thoughts on these new policies. Welcome, Chief, and thank you very much for taking the time. You're spending most of your time going from group to group to group, pretty much doing exactly what you could be doing right here. Well, hopefully, though, this is going to get out to more people, so you won't have to be saying the same thing over and over again. We have a series of questions that we're going to be asking and give you the full chance to say whatever you want as far as a response. First question. The initial recommendation from the Reimagining Public Safety Community Task Force called for a $10.3 million reduction in the budget for the Richmond Police Department. It also called for an across-the-board 11% cut in expenses, such as rent, utility expenses, insurance, overtime, and vehicle allowances. And what alarmed the community perhaps the most was the requirement that 25 sworn police officers be terminated. The task force later amended that recommendation to call for only a $6.3 million reduction. Can you please explain what this will mean to the people of Richmond?
Sure. So when the Public Safety Task Force originally recommended, their original recommendations amounted to a $10.3 million reduction to the police department, I was very surprised and I was alarmed. The recommendations called for the reduction of 25 police officers as well as several other costs for the police department, including cost pool and insurance and utilities and things that I actually personally don't have the ability to reduce. And so I was concerned about how I would get to that $10.3 million reduction. And so it actually turned out that in order to reduce the police department by $10.3 million, as opposed to 25 police officers being laid off, we were going to have to look at laying off about 32 officers. So luckily that didn't happen. The figure was reduced, and ultimately we were reduced by $3 million, which essentially eliminated the 12 vacant positions that I had here in the police department.
Okay. Many of the more successful programs, such as ShotSpotter, may have to be curtailed. Also, the RPD's involvement with the Police Activities League, PAL. Please explain what kinds of programs may have to be curtailed and how this will impact the people.
So when we were looking at the $10.3 million reduction, we had to look at all the ways that we could cut, because I wanted the impact to be the least for our working officers. I didn't want to have to lay off any officers, even though with the cuts we were looking at laying off 32 officers plus eliminating other contracts to include our PAL contract, which we are a major contributor to PAL, as well as eliminating contracts like ShotSpotter and police strategies. And these are all things that we've had to help us fight crime and address criminal issues here in Richmond. Not only that, the police strategies contract is one that we recently had approved by the City Council, and that's going to look at all of our uses of force in terms of looking at reform efforts and putting things in place that are more transparent for the community. So I was concerned about losing those contracts that actually help us build trust within our community and help us to respond better to crime issues, like the shot spotter telling us exactly where we need to go when shots are being fired. So again, luckily, we didn't have to cut those contracts when the amount was reduced to $3 million, but those were contracts that we're looking at reducing if we had to reduce our department by $10.3 million.
If the city still hosts some of the festivities and events that we've gotten used to, like Cinco de Mayo, the July 3rd fireworks presentation, National Night Out, and the Juneteenth celebration, will the police be able to patrol these? Will we have the funding for that?
It's going to be very difficult for us to participate in the levels that we've participated in the past. So all these festivals and events take a lot of resources. That means all these events have times when we have to close down streets and we have to get traffic through. So those events take a lot of officers, and all of those officers are mainly, most of the time, here on overtime to do those extra duties. We're so short-staffed at this point with officers, not only just losing all the officers that we just lost through the last budget cycle, which was 20 sworn police officers, and then through this last budget cycle and the Reimagining Public Safety, which was another 12 officers. So that's 32 officer positions that we've lost in the last 2 years alone. And so there's the same amount of work to deal with that we have. So we still have all the calls to service that we still answer, the events that we still attend, and we have more officers actually out on injury leave and light duty than we've had before. We have 25 officers out on injury leave. So that means there's a very small amount of officers, about 100 officers, to do everything that we need to do. And with that low amount of officers, we don't have enough officers, especially with vacations and trainings that we send officers to respond to the calls for service. That means we have mandatory overtime that officers are forced to work almost on a daily basis because we're so short-staffed. So now we're asking them to work this mandatory overtime. That means, they expect to get off at 5 o'clock, and we're telling them, well, somebody on the next shift called in sick, and so you're going to have to stay and work another 4 hours. That's mandatory overtime. And then we're asking them to sign up to come in on the weekends to do special events, and people are burnt out. Officers are burnt out. They don't want to work as much overtime as they're working, that we're forcing them to work. And so these events, these extracurricular events, get challenging to staff. But they're important to staff. We understand that it's also part of our community policing model to be engaged in these extracurricular events and these non-enforcement contacts with the public, because we understand that's how you build trust, that's how you build relationships. But the lower our staffing is, the more challenging these things become.
You've already touched on this to some degree, but even though the task force's recommendation called for the terminations of 25 sworn officers, we've heard that you might have had to terminate as many as 32 officers, and at one time it was even 35. Can you explain why the number jumped as it did?
Sure. So the recommendations from the task force included things that I had no control over. So they felt, I think the thinking was, and I'm not positive on this, but I think the thinking was, well, if you have less officers, then you don't need as many patrol vehicles, you don't need as many, you don't need as many utilities within the police department. And that's just simply not true. We still have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation, and we have to have the lights on, we have to be able to flush the toilets and do all the things that we currently do with the amount of officers that we have. So we weren't able to reduce in areas that the task force recommended reducing in. So that meant that in order to meet the $10.3 million reduction to the budget, the only way we could meet that threshold was to eliminate police officer positions. Staffing is over 80% of the police department budget. So you can't get to $10 million reduction with just eliminating, paper, not buying as much paper, or not, paying as many utilities. Those are police officer positions that we have to eliminate to get to that $10.3 million. And that's why we had to increase the number of officers that would be laid off if we had to reduce by $10.3 million.
Okay. The City Council passed a motion that no officers would be terminated this year. There was talk about not filling vacant positions. Can you elaborate on these, please?
Sure. So I think that there was a lot of pushback from the community about losing police officers. I personally talked about the harm that eliminating current working police officers would do to our community, and so they backed off of the want to lay off officers to get to that $10.3 million. And I'm glad that they did it, because I want to assure the officers that they would have jobs. There was a lot of discussion around the department. A lot of officers applied for jobs at other departments because they were unsure about their job security. We actually currently have, so we've had officers leave because they were concerned about that job security, and we still have people leaving our department to go to other departments because of the continued work of the task force. I'm glad that, finally the city council came out and said, there will not be any layoffs, but there were 12 vacant positions that we had that they said that I could not fill, and so we lost those 12 positions, and that's what amounted to the $3 million that they reallocated to other services.
What was the peak number of officers authorized for the RPD, and what will it be now? And even if you can think about going back in previous decades, how many officers did we have?
So the peak number was 203, and that was under Chris Magnus. Now, even going back, I think around the time that I was hired, we had over 170 plus officers. Our now authorized strength of officers is 145. Now, if you'll remember, I said there's 25 officers off on injury leave. So we're authorized to have 145 officers. We've already had 5 resignations in the last month, with officers leaving for other departments, and a couple of medical retirements. And so we're down to, I think, 139 officers, and then 25 of those are off on injury leave or light duty. So we have a little over 100 officers to do the same work that 200 officers were doing several years ago.
Many members of the task force and the public have argued that the police do nothing to reduce or prevent crime. Can you please reply to this to explain the impact that a fully funded police force might have in reducing or preventing crime? Specifically, if provided the resources, what actions can they take to make Richmond safer?
So this has probably been one of the most frustrating, things that have come out of the discussion about reimagining public safety, is that the police don't prevent crime. That is just simply not true. We do things every day to prevent crime. I even have a crime prevention unit, although it has one crime prevention manager right now, but we used to have another person, and we have a whole crime prevention volunteer team that we work with on year round, doing events to work on preventing crime. So it's really frustrating that this term that we don't prevent crime is thrown around. We took over 300 guns off the street last year, and you cannot tell me that not one of those guns were going to be used in a crime here in the city of Richmond. We took guns off the streets when we knew people were on their way to do a shooting here in our city. So you cannot tell me that we did not prevent crime. You can't tell me when somebody's getting ready to break into a car and they see a police officer pass by that they don't stop and think about it. They're not going to just break into a car or commit a criminal act right in front of a police officer. So we prevent crime on a daily basis. Not only that, we continually work with our community on crime prevention efforts and measures, working on things like SEPTED, telling people how to secure their homes so that it's less likely a target for burglars. When there's certain thefts, like at Pacific East Mall with cars, we go around and talk to the people that are parking to let them know about the thefts, to pass out information on how they can protect themselves. Same thing on identity thefts. We're constantly trying to talk to people and get the information out and work with our community on crime prevention measures.
All across West County, each city used to have officers assigned to the high schools, with the school district footing a large part of the bill for these services. Can you tell us the impact these officers made to the safety of our youth? And can you address the negative comments made by some students and their parents that said they felt less safe with officers on campus?
Yeah, I mean, I won't, negate anybody's personal feelings or perspective on how they feel with the police officers being on campus, but I could tell you that I received a lot of positive feedback from the community, from young people about working with our SRO officer. And then the school district, the teachers, the principals, all had great things to say about the school resource officers working at the various schools that we have across our city. And these relationships are important. So not only, the school resource officers aren't there to enforce laws or anything like that. Yeah, there is some enforcement action that they'll have to take because that's the nature of our job. But being a school resource officer, we expected so much more than that. We wanted the officers there to build relationships with the young people so that if there was an issue or a problem, that the young people at these schools would feel comfortable enough to come to the school resource officers to report things. We had so many young people come to school resource officers and say, hey, so-and-so has a gun, so-and-so has a knife, hey, there's gonna be a fight after school, and then we could put things in place to prevent fights from happening. We can work on a plan to call a student out that has a gun in their backpack so that nobody else is put in harm's way or is hurt. We were able to build those relationships that really helped us to deal with the issues within the high schools without making it a policing issue, meaning without taking people to jail. Occasionally, we did have to arrest students, but that was few and far between. And then even with that, we put in a program in place, a diversion program, so that we didn't have to send those cases to the district attorney's office for prosecuting. We did everything that we could to work with young people to keep them out of the criminal justice system, even though they were interacting with the police department. And so without being on the schools and building those relationships, it puts us in a tough position where if we're just responding, if it's beat officers responding to a crime that's related to a young person, they only have a certain amount of time to deal with that crime. They don't have the time that school resource officers had to, work with the families and try to come up with a long-term solution to issues. Beat officers have a short period of time to resolve an issue to move on to the next issue that comes up. And so without the school resource officers, we won't have the officers be able to dedicate that long-term time to resolve issues. We'll work as hard as we can because we don't want to put kids into the system, but we're losing those relationship buildings, the trust building with the young people that we have by having the school resource officers in the schools.
Okay. A significant effort has been made to reallocate funds that otherwise would go to the RPD and now will be used for the homeless. What kinds of crimes are typically associated with Richmond's unhoused residents? Nearly $3 million of those funds are proposed for shower and sanitary facilities, a transitional village, and the SOS street teams. Can you explain to us your thoughts on how this reallocation of funds will translate to making Richmond safer?
So first I'll say I do think that we need more resources for homeless people, unhoused people. They do need shower services. They need housing. And unfortunately we're not in a position to be able to provide housing for everyone, but on a state level, federal level, that's ultimately what we need, is to be able to house people. The reallocation of funds and the things that they're doing with the funds, I don't think are necessarily going to reduce crime. They're going to help the unhoused people, be able to provide some resources. But in terms of the crimes that we're seeing shootings, assaults with deadly weapons, and it would be nice if a shower can help somebody stop assaulting somebody else, but that's just not reality. So while I agree that these services need to be funded for the homeless, I don't think that these services that are going to be provided to our unhoused community are necessarily going to help influence the crime that's occurring in these homeless encampments.
While a great many Richmond residents seem to think that Richmond police officers provide valuable services for the community, we've heard numerous horror stories from our neighbors about their negative interactions with the police here in Richmond. These negative comments seem to largely come from communities of color. As the Chief of Police, what efforts do you envision for learning about these everyday negative interactions and modifying how the officers interact with the people they've sworn to protect so future generations won't have those horror stories to tell?
Alright, so this is everything that we're talking about in terms of reform, the harms that the police have caused in communities, and especially communities of color, and how we move forward. And so I think there's really two parts. So internally, I'm working on some reform efforts that include cultural competency training for our officers so that they understand the communities that we serve, making sure we have policies and procedures in place so that there's clear guidelines for officers to follow, so that we don't continue to create these harms within the community. But I think in terms of hearing from the community, that's also been a challenge. You know, we've had some community forums, but we have to continue to have some honest dialogue about the harms that we've created, but also solutions on how we can move forward. I want to thoroughly acknowledge those harms that we've created, and especially here in Richmond with the history of the Cowboys and other, you know, issues that have caused the community to lose trust within the department. But I also want to know, you know, how we can move forward from that. What can we do now to move forward from that and not continue to create those harms? We have, a couple years ago, we put our, what everybody typically calls our internal affairs, we call it our Office of Professional Accountability. We hired a civilian to run that office, so it's eyes outside of the department per se, not a police officer that's looking at the cases to make sure that we are holding our officers accountable, that the community feels like there's somebody that they could go to make a complaint. We thoroughly investigate those complaints. We actually get a very small number of complaints from the community. Most of the complaints that we investigate every year are internally generated, meaning that we look at body cam footage or, you know, however we get the information. We look at that and determine, hey, there might be something that an officer did wrong, or we want to look more deeper into, and we send that case to our internal affairs, our Office of Professional Accountability, to thoroughly investigate. Now that's done internally. Again, we get very few complaints from the community. In addition to having our Office of Professional Accountability, which we have offsite to make it more easy for people to come, you know, they not feel like they have to come to the police department to make a complaint. They could go to City Hall to do that. But there's also the Community Police Review Commission that also takes complaints, and they also receive very few complaints from the community on a yearly basis. I think every year, for as long as I can remember, they've received 5 or less complaints from the community about policing. So one complaint is too many. But I will say, for all the contacts that we have throughout the year, 5 is not a lot of complaints for the police department to receive. And out of those 5 complaints, not all of them are even sustained, even from the Community Police Review Commission. So I think that just offering the opportunity for people to voice their concerns, making sure that we thoroughly discuss instances in which officers could have done a better job. You know, we talk about that with the community so that we keep the lines of communication open and that we can continue to build that trust.
One of the task force's working groups recommended that the RPD include more training in specific areas, but these were rejected by the task force. Can you share with us your thoughts on these rejected suggestions? The first being shift emphasis from firearm to less lethal use of force.
So I'll start off by saying that even though these are recommendations that were rejected by the task force, some of these things are things that we've already been working on here as a department, and it is my job as the chief of police to determine the training, what we do in terms of training within the police department. So whether they rejected them or not, it's up to me to determine if I'm going to implement these things. And so some of these things we've already implemented. So the first one was?
Again, shifting emphasis from firearm to less lethal use of force.
So all of our training, we try to encompass everything in. So we don't just focus on, when we do have firearms training, we incorporate de-escalation into that. We incorporate everything that will lead up to that use of firearms. So it's all encompassing. So we're going to continue to train in a way that we incorporate everything that an officer is going to have to do leading up to using deadly force, unfortunately, into our training, and we'll continue to keep it that way.
Many of these next rejected items and suggestions are similar, so you don't need to go into great detail in repeating yourself. Focus on physical restraint training that would reduce the likelihood of the use of deadly force.
So that's something that we already do. We look at physical restraint training, and that's what we hope to do. Instead of using deadly force, and I think our records indicate that.
Separate police emergency and non-emergency police response calls and ensure dispatch operators have cultural competency training on par with police officers.
So the cultural competency training is something that we just recently incorporated. We're starting off with the new officers that we're bringing in, and then we will incorporate that into the officers that are already working, and then eventually incorporate it with the entire department. Now, training is difficult because it's done on overtime, so we have to phase these things in, and we plan to do that.
Ensuring field training officers receive same level cultural competency as recruit officers with an emphasis on Richmond-specific cultural training.
Yeah, that's something that I incorporated already into our training, and like I said, it's going to be a phased-in approach, but the training officers will also receive the cultural competency training.
Okay, and the last item that was rejected, ensure additional scenario-based training incorporated into training plans with an emphasis focusing on diversity in age, ethnicity, and sexual identity.
And even though it was a rejected recommendation, I think that it will be a good thing to incorporate those things into our cultural competency training, and we will be doing that.
Okay. Between the task force and the majority of the City Council, the opinion seems to be that any reduction in violent crime in Richmond is the result of the work of the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And since they've made such progress with the limited funds provided, the belief is that if their budget is nearly doubled, they'll be able to make Richmond even safer. I realize that this is a politically charged question, but can you address the idea that the ONS has been the major force behind the reduction of crime in Richmond?
So I can't say if they've been the major force or not. I think that over the years, Richmond has put in a lot of innovative practices into our city, including the Office of Neighborhood Safety, including our renewed community policing model, keeping officers in districts for long periods of time. We have the ceasefire movement. We've just done a lot of innovative things to really address violent crime here in the city. So I think it's been a shared responsibility between all of us, and I think that that's what's reduced crime here in our city.
Okay. Can you give us a ballpark figure about how much it costs Richmond to train an officer between the time an application is filed to the end of the probationary period?
A lot of money. Until the end of the probationary period.
Well, that's when they become a full-fledged police officer, isn't it?
Yes. So I would say probably $500,000 at least.
So when we lose these police officers to other departments, we've spent the money to train them. This hurts our budget, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was part of the presentation that I provided to the council when I talked about the impacts, the Reimagining public safety proposals, and when we were looking at reducing officers, what the impacts of the department will be. We've really invested in, when we hire police officers, it's an investment. We're training them. Sometimes we're sending them to the academy. We're training them when they come out of the academy. And to lose those officers is a huge gain for a lot of other departments, because Richmond does a lot more than a lot of other departments in terms of our community policing, but in terms of also answering calls and being exposed to a myriad of calls for service and homicide. So they take all this knowledge and experience to the other departments that have to do very little to get them up and running, just probably geography training, because they've received all their necessary training and even, baseline experience here in Richmond. And so it's a huge loss for our department and a huge loss in our investment into these officers.
Okay, this segues into the next question. Since these demands to defund the police started, how many officers and staff members has the department lost? And then can you give us a ballpark figure about what kind of financial hit Richmond has taken by using our tax dollars to train officers and staff that migrated to other departments?
So I can say there's been, since we started talking about the reimagining and defunding the department, I've had about seven resignations of officers going to other departments. So these aren't officers that are retiring from the profession, although two decided to get out of the profession altogether and left. So that's actually addition. So about 9 people that have left the profession or left the department due to the discussion around defunding and reallocation of funds. In terms of the cost, it's in the millions of dollars.
Well, at $500,000 apiece times 9, we do the math. That's a lot of money, as you said. All right. Please tell us about yourself as Richmond's top cop. How long have you been in Richmond? Do you live here in Richmond? Do you have a family here in Richmond? How long have you been on the force? And what was your path from the academy to become the police chief?
So I've been with the Richmond Police Department since 1998, so 23 years. And I, joined the Richmond Police Department. I was a student at Contra Costa College, and at the time had a professor that worked here and encouraged me to apply with this department. And when I applied, I never, had the thought of wanting to become a police chief. My goal was to serve our community and drive around in a black and white and help people. And it wasn't until I saw ways in which I can have a greater impact on the community and the department that I thought about promoting, and which led me to eventually where I am now. Not seeing a lot of women in senior management positions, or weren't any women in the senior management position when I was promoting into those positions. And I understood, sitting at the table, actually this table right here, with a room full of other men, that they were missing the perspective of a woman. And so I wanted to bring that perspective, and that's kind of what pushed me to continue to promote into the various management positions. Now, in terms of my time here in Richmond, I am actually a Richmond resident. I live here. I've lived here for the past 16 years. When I first got hired, I lived here. I moved out of the city for a couple of years and then moved back. And I'm raising my family here. I raised 3 kids. Well, not completely raised. I have a 12-year-old still, but 12-year-old, 18-year-old, and 27-year-old were all brought up here in Richmond, and I'm married. And I have a connection to Richmond. I moved from San Francisco, where I was born, to the East Bay city of San Pablo when I was young, and so I've always been familiar with the Richmond area. I had friends in school that lived in Richmond, so there's always been ties, and I also have family that lives here besides my own family.
With the limitations placed on what you have to work with, tell us about your vision for making Richmond a safer place for Richmond residents.
So my vision would be to continue all of the great practices that we put in place that actually reduce crime here in our community. My concern is with the reduced resources that are given to me, that I'm concerned about the level of crime that will increase, or if it will increase. My vision is that we can continue to engage with our community at events and festivals and in non-enforcement ways, that we could continue to build relationship and build trust, that we can address the past harms that we've done as law enforcement against our community, and that we can work with the community together on a new path forward, and that we will have a safe community to live, work, and play in.
Thank you very much. Now, before we close up, give you an opportunity to add anything that I may not have touched on.
I think you touched on everything, Don.
Okay. I want to thank you again for making the time to get this out to the public. Every little bit of information that the public has is just more information that they had before, so now they're dealing with facts as opposed to suppositions, and they're getting it from the top of the food chain here.
All right.
So, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.